I'm Michelle Ray Zellinger. Allow me to introduce myself. For 30 years, I've been a major network news editor in Denver, Colorado. I am also a photographic artist with my own photography business. In 2010, I joined my children's school excursion to Denver's Babi Yar Park. Deeply moved by the park and its surroundings, I took a number of photographs with a view towards the Shoah, or catastrophe, from inside a boxcar, reminiscent of the ones that transported millions of Jews and others targeted and persecuted by the Nazis. I took photographs with the lens of my camera through the slats of the boxcar. I focused on and shot the soul-stirring poem etched into a giant stone at the entrance to Babi Yar Park. Well known is the tragic fact that millions of Jews and other victims of the murderous Nazi regime were taken by force to their deaths at concentration camps throughout Europe. Perhaps less well known is that on September 29th and 30th, 1941, in a Ukrainian forest at Babi Yar, northwest of Kiev, some 33,731 Jews, Ukrainians, and Roma were shot and murdered in small groups by the Nazis. The murderers then pushed the bodies of the victims, men, women, children, into the ravine at Babi Yar. Within a few months thereafter, the Nazis had murdered some 100,000 souls at Babi Yar. Impressed and moved by Babi Yar Park, I wanted to find out who wrote the etched poetry, who spearheaded and financed this idea and implementation of the park. I learned that the park's founders were Lillian Hoffman, Rabbi Samuel Edelman, Rabbi Raymond Zwerin, who also wrote the etched poetry, Helen J. Ginsberg, Mr. Alan Gass, and the Committee of Concern with Soviet Jewry. Along with my still photo, I present to you an interview of the founders of Babi Yar Park and their remarkable story about its conception. Rabbi Zwerin and the late Lillian Hoffman of blessed memory started this idea with the intent to create awareness of Soviet Jewry. They brought Helen J. Ginsberg into their group to seek financing and sculpture. You will hear how Helen was invited to the White House by President Jimmy Carter, about the role Rabbi Zwerin played as a mediator among prominent local groups, and Alan Gass's role as the lead architect, as well as his perspective on the park's design. Together, their stories are quite remarkable.
About 1964-5, one of the rabbis of Denver, Rabbi Samuel Edelman of blessed memory, went to the Soviet Union on a tour to see what the situation was with the Jews of the Soviet Union. And he came back after this short visit, and he addressed about 1,200 people at Temple Emmanuel in Denver, the whole community actually, and basically talked about the fact that the Jews in the Soviet Union were being terribly discriminated upon, that things were awful under Stalin, but now that Stalin was dead, things had gotten worse under the current regime, and something had to be done about it politically and personally. That Jews were being kicked out of universities, not allowed to go to universities, were losing their jobs. It was sort of like Nuremberg laws all over again, and we're talking about 3-4 million Jews then in the Soviet Union. We decided in Denver to start a committee of concern on behalf of Soviet Jews, and I formed it along with Lillian Hoffman, and we sooner or later got a number of people to become very involved in it. We started writing letters to Jews in the Soviet Union, telling them we support them and we're with them. We started to take names of people in the Soviet Union and politicized the lack of well-being that they were suffering from. Other communities in the United States started to form committees of concern for Soviet Jewry, and we were in conference with them all, and we were organizing and talking about programs and the like together. One of the things that we did was, we thought was pretty radical at the time, considering this was about 1967. The play Fiddler on the Roof was coming to Denver for the first time. And we got about 40, 50 people, and we went down to the theater, and we chained ourselves to the front of the theater with big signs saying, we're free to see this play, but in the Soviet Union you can't see it. And especially if you're a Jew, you cannot see this play. It will not play in the Soviet Union, and even if it did, you wouldn't be allowed to go and see it. And that made headlines in the papers, and it sort of put the Committee of Concern for Soviet Jewry on the map in Denver. Lillian Hoffman then decided that she would go and visit the Soviet Union and take presents for people who were suffering because they had lost jobs and were really having a hard time feeding their families. And the thing that she took were, she took religious objects, she took prayer books, and she took taluses, and she took tefillin, but she took jeans. She took Levi's, torn jeans, under the guise of it being her clothing. She took half a dozen pair of torn jeans, and in the Soviet Union at the time, they were like gold. They were called Strauskys, and she gave them out to the families that really needed the money, and they were able to sell it for months' worth of food, 2 months' worth of food, each pair of pants. And the community itself was able to utilize the religious objects as well, and I'm sure she left a few dollars along the way as well. And she came back with renewed fervor to keep the process of writing letters, pen pals, going, and it was something that was done for the next 12 to 15 years. There was never a lull in the writing, knowing full well that the phones were tapped and you had to be careful with what you said. About 1967, I decided that we needed something more dramatic, something that was something that would be a statement in Colorado as to how we can talk about the problem of the Soviet Jews. And Lil and I got together and came up with an idea that we thought was terrific, and that was to link the worst of the Holocaust in the Ukraine with the plight of the Soviet Jews today. That awful event was the massacre at Babi Yar. In the Ukraine, it's called Babi Yar. And approximately that time, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, a Russian author, wrote the poem Babi Yar, which was almost scandalous in Russia, but it was well received in the West and translated into English, and many people were reading it, and it sort of validated our concept of linking Babi Yar with the plight of Soviet Jewry. What we could do is create a park in Colorado. At the time, there were very few Holocaust memorials anywhere in the country, and certainly none that commemorated the tragedy at Babi Yar. And so we looked around the city. Denver in 1967 was an empty place, a couple 100,000 people, maybe 250,000 population in all. And we found this terrific location, 22 acres, with a ravine, just like the park at Babi Yar in the Ukraine.
And do you happen to remember the location of the area?
Yeah, the location is on Havana and Yale. Havana and Parker Road, essentially, is bordered by Parker and Yale. I live in Yale and Havana. And totally empty and nothing anywhere around it. On the outskirts, in the hinterland of Denver, but still in the city limits of Denver, the very end of the city limits. And so we decided, how do we go about getting this park dedicated to the memory of those who died at Babi Yar, but also in honor of those who are struggling in the Soviet Union at the time. We started off by going to the governor of the state. We went to John Love, and we sat with him. He gave us a lot of time, a long audience. And after we were finished talking about this concept and bringing him up to date on the plight of Soviet Jews, he got pretty excited about it. And he said, I'm merely the governor of the state. You're going to have to go talk to Billy, which is what he called him, who was the mayor, William McNichols, and Jr. And so we made an appointment with Mayor McNichols, and Lil and I went to see him. And he had an assistant at the time who we both knew very well, a man by the name of Ben Bezoff, who also sat in on the meeting. And we brought the mayor up to speed. And at the end of our maybe hour-long meeting, he said, I like that. I like the idea very much. And he looks at his assistant and he says, Ben, make it happen. And within days, the concept of getting a park dedicated with the name Babi Yar was in the works and ready to go.
And let me ask you too, was the park donated, the land donated from Mayor McNichols?
No, the land became a city park, just like the hundreds of other city parks with names on them. Mm-hmm. You don't have to own the park to have the park, and it's just the city and county that names it Babi Yar Park. And all of the parks in Denver had a sign that said such and such park, and under it, for your enjoyment. And this park also had the Babi Yar Park, for your enjoyment. So we called the mayor's office and said, can you take that sign and get rid of the for your enjoyment? This is not an enjoyment park. This is not a recreational park. This is a memorial park. There's no slides, no swings. Mm-hmm. There's no play part in here. This is a memorial, a dedicated memorial, and also an honorial. And within weeks, they redid the sign and took out for your enjoyment. And the park was filled with wild grasses. It was just a weed, just 22 acres of weeds. And the ravine had some water in it, sort of runoff water. 1971, we wrote a letter to Elie Mizell, told him about Babi Yar Park, and asked him if he would come for the dedication. And on a cold, blustery day in March 1971, he did come, and he did dedicate the park. And he said, as he looked at it, it's a park that really stands in memory of the Babi Yar in the Ukraine near Kiev, or Kyiv, because of the ravine and because of the topography. And that's essentially where the getting of the park, the history of getting the park comes into being. The next part of this, of course, is what do we do with it? It's a bunch of acreage. Well, we managed to get some goats to come and eat some of the grasses and the like, but we needed something that really would stand for and would be a reminder of the Jews who died, but also the Jews who are alive and suffering right now. And that's when I turned to Helen Ginsberg and said, go do it.
Not quite that way.
Well, how is your interpretation, Helen?
Well, I was called by Lillian Hoffman, who was a friend of my mother's. So right there, I'm caught in a little spot. And she said, Helen, this is my project, Babi Yar. We want to develop it as a park, and you're a sculptor. Maybe you could come up with something or know someone who could do something with it. And so I'd like you to take charge of all of that. And I said, Lillian, I never heard of Babi Yar Park. I don't know if it's something I'd really want to do, but I'll come to your meeting and I'll listen, and perhaps there's something I can do there. But when I got there, the room was filled with a number of rabbis, and Lillian, and I was sitting next to her, and lo and behold, she stood up and said, and Helen Ginsberg has agreed to chair the Babi Yar Park project. Suddenly the rabbi was there and saying, wonderful, wonderful, couldn't be better. And what are you going to do? Say, no, I didn't say that. I was stuck, and changed the course of my life in many ways, and certainly enriched it. And I'm still involved with Babi Yar Park. I began to realize how large a deal this was. Thought, okay, start with the committee. And I wanted to have both men and women on my committee, and people that I felt had some relationship to this, who were might be in the architectural field, or maybe they're great gardeners or painters, people that might have an interest aesthetically in what we might do with a piece of land like that. And I called a number of people, and we had a nice first meeting with all of these people and began to plan what to do, and realized that the whole park was the memorial, not just a place in it to hold a particular sculpture or fountain, anything. The whole park had to be the memorial. And that's when we discovered that Lillian also had a friend whose son was an architect in San Francisco and who had developed Skyline Park. We all get together at Lillian's, and we're feeding this information to a gentleman by the name of Satora Nishita. And as we're all talking at once, probably, of what we might do here, he said, please stop, all of you, stop talking. Let me think quietly. And we all sat looking at one another. And he said, I must do this. I must do this because my people were wrongfully interred in camps here in the United States. He was Japanese. And he said, I have the heart to do this, and I would very much like to develop it. We were tickled. We had a big name architectural firm, wonderful people to work with. And they did a masterful job, really. And as part of the process, at one time, I was called by SAT and asked if I could come out to San Francisco to see the mock-up of the park. And what you see there today is almost identical to that. They did a phenomenal job. But the interesting thing was he had 3 points of main interest in the park, and then he wanted to have between these places somewhere you could sit and contemplate and just have quiet time. And he said that when he started drawing the connections of all of this, he had the Star of David right there on that piece of paper, forming the pathways in the park. And of course, I was excited to go out there and see it, and just blown away. I mean, this was such an experience, and so perfect, which our whole group agreed with. By the way, that star can be seen when you're flying overhead. His idea was, in making the park the memorial, to have these 3 main stations, which we eventually named the People Place, the Grove of Remembrance, and the bridge across the ravine. The People Place was where we could all gather. Individuals could gather and do whatever people want to do. And it was round, centered, and in the center of this, Senator John Birmingham got in touch with me. He had been hearing about this, very impressed with the idea of the park. And he called and said, Helen, I have something for you. Could you come to my offices? So I went there, and he takes a briefcase, carrying case of, and he said, I was at Kiev. I asked to be taken to the Babi Yar ravine, and it wasn't easy to get there. And he said he doesn't know what made him do it, but he took this little duffel bag with him. And he actually climbed down into the ravine and with his bare hands dug up dirt, which could be the bones of our people, mixed in with that dirt, and he brought it to us. And that is centered in the middle of the People Place. If you look, it's got a bronze cap over it, and it explains who got it, who put it there, and what it was. That was such a moving experience there. So Sat had then taken us from the People Place to the Grove of Remembrance. That is a place of quiet contemplation, 100 trees there, each representing 1,000 Jews who died at Babi Yar, at least.
Or 200,000.
200,000.
Yeah.
And a fountain, small fountain in the center of that, because water is life. Without it, there's no life. And it was a very simple fountain. It wasn't anything big, gaudy, anything of the sort. It was maybe 2 feet off the ground at most, and a huge round circle of black and gray granite in which was inscribed our logo, which is a maple leaf with the stem up and a teardrop in the center of the leaf. It was the last thing to be dedicated in the park. We let the community of Russian Jews that were here in Denver know about it if they wanted to attend that we were going to unveil their fountain. It's about 50, I would say, men and women from the Russian community came, and when we got to the top, they all stopped and just stared at it. And I thought, oh my goodness. I was heartsick. I thought, they aren't impressed. It isn't impressive. It's just meaningful. Maybe they don't see that. And Senator Joyce Foster was there and spoke of that, and she and I looked at each other, and she said what she had to say, and everyone's quiet, and I was just dying inside. Then suddenly one man stepped forward, walked up to the fountain, got down on a knee, held his hands out, and let the waters of life wash over his hands. And then that whole gathering of people did the same thing, and they did love it. They had gotten the essence of it. Nothing showy, very simple, meaningful, and that was it. From there, we cross over to the bridge across the ravine. It was fashioned to look somewhat like the kind of boxcars that Jews were carried in, and except that what we did was cut slats in the sides of the bridge, which is very high on each side, so that you could look through there into the ravine, which is the last thing the people slaughtered there saw. And that's very moving. And each one of these areas have this beautiful, meaningful, philosophical bit of poetry inscribed, thanks to Rabbi Zwerin. And it's a simply beautiful, quiet, contemplative place.
Prior to the park getting there, obviously you had to get funding. So tell us how you went about finding money.
I dug awfully hard, and it was not easy to come up with. And I would tell you that the dollars that helped put Babi Yar there initially came from little people with few dollars who were so deeply touched among the non-Jewish community. See, we ran into quite a difficulty because I thought, well, raising funds, we'll send out mailers, we'll let the whole community know what we're doing, and of course it's going to happen. No, that isn't what was going to happen.
One of the conflicts, of course, was that it was right after the 1973 war and the Yom Kippur War. And so the community was raising money for Israel, and Helen and her committee were sort of in competition for bucks, and that was difficult.
So they obviously didn't want to allocate the money to your program because they had other ideas for their fund.
Right. Every dollar needed to go to Israel somehow.
There were Alan Gass, who was an architect and belonged to Temple Sinai at the time, and he is the record keeper, premier record keeper. And so everything was noted by him. Then there was Jim Buchanan III, an attorney who helped us with some important letters we had to write. And a third was a man by the name of Ted Ruskin, who would do anything and everything and simply stopped me at Temple one day. And I'd been taking some flack about this project because the community thought I was going to take money from the coffers they had to do this park. And Ted walked up to me and said, "Are you the Helen Ginsberg that's building this park?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Wonderful idea. Can I be part of that?" And he was a very precious part of that. It really came down to who's going to fundraise. Helen's going to fundraise. Who's going to speak? Helen's going to speak. We were going to build the park, except we weren't coming up with the monies we needed.
And so what did you do, Helen?
Well, what would anyone do? You go to the President of the United States, of course.
Why not?
Jimmy Carter was known as the humanitarian president, so I had Jim Buchanan write a beautiful letter to people he knew and see to it that it got to Washington and to the president, which it did. And lo and behold, I'm sitting at the kitchen table going through the mail and tossing the junk mail to one side, which fortunately my son, Noel Ginsberg, was sitting there. He said, "Mom, why are you tossing this away? It's from the White House." And I said, "No, honey, it's not from the White House. That's a painting company here in Denver." He said, "Mom, I don't think they could use the emblem of the United States on their stationery." "Oh, let me see that." There was the acceptance I'd be going to Washington and promised to take him with me. It was remarkable. And then an interesting thing occurred. I was informed that two gentlemen from the organization that we were sparring with a bit would also be going at the same time. Okay, that's fine. And we all met in Washington the day before, and one of them suggested we be up and in the restaurant for breakfast to decide what we're going to tell the president we need. And I said, "You guys go. I know what I have to say, and I don't have to prepare for it. I know what I'd like to ask him. I don't tell presidents anything. I ask." That was it. I went to sleep. They had their meeting. We met, went to the White House. I remember walking through the corridors and thinking how my footsteps were mingling with the past and all the great people who walked down that way. And we go into the big conference room you very often see on TV. There are probably 40 seats around that huge, long table, big, heavy leather chairs. And all of a sudden it's announced that the President of the United States is entering, and the doors swing wide, and Jimmy Carter walks in and calls us up from the side of the table where we had been seated and said, "We can't talk face to face sitting in a line. Let's go to the end of the table. Mrs. Ginsberg, you come sit next to me." We all sit down, and he asked me why I'm here. And so I told him certainly what what we were doing. I was hoping that maybe we could have some support from him for the park, and the fact that he is our most humanistic president, I guess. And I don't know what I said. Whatever it was, it worked. And he said, I believe in this project, and I am going to help you. And then he turned to see what the two gentlemen from the other organization had to say. But at the time that he did that, and he's looking at them, I sensed something happening between his chair and mine. So I scooted back in the big chair. Of course, then I couldn't even touch my feet to the ground. And looked down, and his hand was extended to me under the table. Well, what would you do? You reach back. And I kind of giggled when that happened because, oh my God, the President of the United States is going to come on. And I remember thinking how soft and smooth those hands were, and as if he'd never done a moment's work, hard labor. But when his secretary walked in at one point, had this little smirk on her face when she looked down and saw that, and he and I let go, and he signed some papers that she had brought in for him to sign. And we talked some more, and he's listening to the other gentleman talking, and then it's all over, and everyone is to leave, and he asks if I would stay for just a moment. And he said, I'm interested in your project, and I have funds that were allocated to Colorado from the Big Thompson flood, and they're sitting there waiting for the proper usage, and that money's going to you. Believe it or not, there's some question whether it was $75,000 or $175,000. I believe it was the 75. Anyway, it was more than I could raise in one speech, and I gave so many of them in churches, in auditoriums, in business lunchrooms, everything, trying to raise money here. And it was done. He said, the reason is I'm going to, I think, see that we have a Holocaust memorial built. This is an important subject. And I said, oh, wonderful, and where's that going to be, Mr. President? He said, well, I thought New York City because there are the most Jews there. And I said, but Mr. President, we know what's happened to us. It has to be here in Washington. It has to be in the seat of our democracy where everyone comes to learn about the United States of America. And that gives the credibility that this should have had long ago. People have to know about the Holocaust. Now, I'm quite sure he didn't build it there after all just because of his discussion with me. I'm sure many said something to him about that. But it was a wonderful event when it was opened, and I got to be there, and it was just great. Then that was followed up about a month and a half later by a phone call from Mondale, Vice President Mondale, saying that Mr. Carter feels, or President Carter doesn't think you stay home at all because he's been trying to call you himself. And this is the reason why. He would like you to be an advisor to the board on the Holocaust Museum development. Would you be interested in doing that? Are you kidding? And so there it was. And I began journeying back and forth to Washington for about a year and a half while all the planning and this and that was going on. And it was an extraordinary, extraordinary experience. I was sworn in to that committee by Tip O'Neill while Elie Wiesel stood and held the Bible. I mean, it was quite impressive. And many of the participants were survivors of the Holocaust and had their numbers on their arms. And it was amazing how the most comedy, the most laughter, the easiest people to talk to were those people. They were just amazing. And everything was over anyway at the meeting, the first meeting with the president. And I'm leaving the White House, and I hear my name called repeatedly, and someone was running down a little hill and saying, Mrs. Ginsberg, the press is here. We'd like you to come up and take the microphone. I was so thrilled because now I could tell all of America about Babi Yar Park and maybe get some more donations. And what do you think they asked me? Why were you and the president holding hands under the table? I couldn't believe that's what they were asking. I didn't even realize they had been in there. I was just wrapped up in looking at the president and wondering if I could slip that little notepad that said White House into my purse or not. And anyway, I said, well, he was saying, you did a good job. You can relax now. Welcome to my home. And I said it was such a generous, kind thing to do. And I was very nervous.
He's a Southern gentleman, and he probably
Yes.
felt your anxiety.
Yes, that's correct. And that was lovely. But isn't it a pity that that's all that they wanted to know about? It was an amazing time. The president assigned a gentleman by the name of Chris Delaporte to handle the project, and he was with us from that point on to the dedication of the park. And I think pretty much that was it. After, of course, they did that and we had the increased funds, because then all of the word got out in Denver and I could get that into the papers. We did get a tremendous amount of donations then, including from that organization, a $30,000 donation to our project with this beautiful letter about how worthwhile it was and how happy they were to support it. And I was very happy to have them send that. And that's how it all began.
We took a picture of a congressional report. Do you want to share a little bit about that with us?
Oh.
What that entailed?
Well, that came because my problems weren't over. The Ukrainian community came to one of our meetings saying, we lost people we loved and cared for at Babi Yar Ravine, and you're making it sound as if it were only the Jewish people that were lost to you. And I thought, oh my goodness, these were not easy people to talk with. And I called the mayor and I said, Mayor Bill, this is what's come up. I think there's going to be some unpleasantness, and I'd like you to announce that you're busy with other things and have to resign as the honorary chair of Babi Yar Park. I didn't want to put him through the kind of grief I knew was coming. And he said, I'm not walking away from you in Babi Yar Park, but I want to ask you a question. Is there validity in their claims? And I said, yes, we have done some research, and to a point there is. Many lives were lost there that weren't Jewish. Gypsies, sick people, whomever they wanted to get rid of. And I said, yes, there was some validity. He said, then Helen, this is a Denver city park. Their names have to appear. And that was a whole other thing which the rabbi, thank goodness, worked on with them. And finally, he was able to work out what we would do. He and Alan Gass. Alan is now the second retired president of the Babi Yar Park, and an amazing help to the project. He was there with you, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Who else was
Shelly Steinhauser
Steinhauser.
was really the moving force behind it. I saw my job after getting the park and after turning this over to Helen and her committee. I was busy starting my own congregation. I had a number of things on my plate, but I sort of saw my role as being the peacemaker between various and sundry factions, factions on the Committee of Concern and the park, factions between the major Jewish organization and the park committee, and I would keep calling these meetings in which we were trying to make nice between the two sides. And then when the Ukrainian issue came up, it was a difficult issue for those of us who understand that the Ukrainians might have been victims to a certain extent, but they were also perpetrators. And so there was a certain unease within the Jewish community to honor the Ukrainians as a whole when this park was created mainly because of Ukrainians who were aiding the Nazis. And yet when the Ukrainians threatened to put the kibosh on the whole park process, even though it's in its final stages of completion, I brought Shelly Steinhauser in, and Shelly was the head of the ADL at the time, Anti-Defamation League, and he met with the representatives of the Ukrainian community here in Denver, and I was at many of those meetings, and in the final analysis we worked out a compromise, and I think the compromise was a good one. The entrance to the park, which you might have mentioned, the entrance to the park consists of two enormous stela, gigantic standing stones, and one has to walk between these two enormous stones, and they're almost in the fantasy shape of the Ten Commandments. I mean, if one were to think of them in that way. On the right-hand side is a poem which I wrote, which talks about the mystic number 6 million and the Jews who died at Babi Yar. And on the left-hand side, it says that this park is in memoriam of the 200,000 Jews, along with Poles, Ukrainians, Gypsies, and others who perished at the ravine at Babi Yar. And so that ameliorated the issue, and they agreed to it, and then made a small contribution to the park, and the stones were inscribed, and peace reigned.
If you wanted to share
All right.
something with us about the congressional area, I think.
Well, what came first was an invitation to be a speaker at one of the hotels to the Ukrainian community to hear from me what this project was about and so forth. And they did fill the room. And I would say primarily these were hard-working people. And when I got up at that podium, this is what I was met with.
Oh.
Closed arms, everything closed up, you know. And I began to talk to them. And little by little, it was somebody else was talking because I was busy watching the arms unfold. And people relaxed, but I'd given the talk so much that the words were just flowing out. And then I got my applause, and I was asked to leave the room. And I was gone about 20 minutes and called back in, and they had collected $10,000 from these people there to whom that money was
Wow.
very precious. And as a result of that, Henry Waxman of California, that's what it was so impressed when he heard how things had been negotiated smoothly, how the dinner went and this and that, and the money was raised so that they could fund the speaker's podium, where James Buchanan's marvelous voice tells very succinctly the story of Babi Yar. And lo and behold, he had my entire speech printed. It was printed on the front page of the 97th Congressional
Record.
Yeah, that's it, record. You hit it on the needle. Okay, so that was a tremendous honor, and I have that hanging in the house. That meant the world to me. And he said how much better a world would be if countries and people could sit down and peacefully, though it wasn't too peaceful sometimes.
Well, it wasn't at stages, but ultimately we all came to understand the reality of the situation. So it was good.
Yeah.
It ended up.
It was all
All's
good.
well that ends well.
Well, that's right.
And Rabbi, let me ask you, in terms of humanity and the emotional aspect of what the park could bring about to a community, what are you hoping that the community receives from the park?
I think anybody who goes through the park understands that it's something different and something special, that it's a quiet and it's a contemplative place. It's not a park for parties, it's not a park for picnics and running and playing and jumping. It's a park to walk around and to think about the potential in humanity that 7.5 billion people on this planet can do to each other if we allow our baser emotions to take hold. And the object is to try to understand that no matter what our color, our faith, our culture, our mores, our ethos, our politics, we're all just humanity. We're all just one people. And if we don't come to understand the oneness in our multiplicity, we end up continually going to war with one another. And war is awful. It destroys the human image. What we could be, what we can be as humanity. What is it that we're looking for in this planet? Are we looking for power? Or are we looking for cooperation? Are we looking for calmness and peace? Or are we looking for tension and strife? Are we looking for extreme wealth and abject poverty? Or are we looking for a way in which everyone will have a chance to eat and a chance to thrive and a chance to grow and a chance to learn and a chance to be the best they can be? There's an old rabbinic story about a Talmudic story about a rabbi by the name of Marzusia. And one of his colleagues and friends comes to him and says, when you get to the world to come, aren't you afraid that you'll be asked, why weren't you like Moses? And Marzusia said, no. When I get to the world to come, I'm afraid that I'll be asked, why weren't you the best Marzusia that you could have been? And I think of that story often when I teach kids. Your job is not to be the best athlete and your job is to be the best you that you can possibly be. And that involves the quality of your values and your virtues and your ability to strive to do better and to do good. And that's what I'm hoping that the park will stand for. A place where people can come and reflect on the terrible events of the past, but on the way in which they can change themselves to become the best they can be.
Since Rabbi Zwerin was there originally, you probably have most of the original story because I wasn't there.
Okay.
But it started with a group called the Committee of Concern with Soviet Jewry, and it was led by Rabbi Zwerin and Rabbi Samuel Edelman of BMH Congregation, and Lillian Hoffman, whose husband was the primary purveyor of cut-rate liquor in Denver.
Now, Lillian had a huge part in this procedure and organization. Can you tell me her involvement before we get started with your
I
involvement?
must say the idea for the Committee of Concern was that of Samuel Edelman, Rabbi Samuel Edelman. Lillian was the self-appointed leader of the group because she had more time than any of them. And their primary goal was to get Jewish people out of the Soviet Union at that time. The Soviet Union didn't like the Jews very much, but they wouldn't let them emigrate. So Lillian's purpose in life basically was to do that, and she propagandized the Soviet Union. She went to the Soviet Union at that time. She tried to get a whole series of people out. She was successful, as a matter of fact, to some degree. Some people did come out. The refuseniks, they were called at that time. And she continued, she and the two rabbis and their group, Shelly Steinhauser, who was at that time regional director of the Anti-Defamation League, was part of the original group. And they worked very hard from Denver, of all places, to get Jews out of the Soviet Union. At some point in the late 60s, I guess it was, they thought it might be a good idea if they could possibly get a park or a street or something in Denver named for the Babi Yar massacre, which had just come to light through a book that had been published and a poem that was written by a Russian poet named Evgeny Evtushenko called Babi Yar. And Soviet Union didn't like it very much, and they tried to repress it, but they weren't successful. But they had just found out about Babi Yar. A lot of the facts of the Holocaust at that time were not well known. It took a long time for most of the horrors of the Holocaust to become known. Many of the survivors didn't want to talk about it. In any case, they went to Bill McNichols, who was mayor of Denver at that time, and asked him if perhaps he had some parkland that hadn't been dedicated yet. And he said, yeah, we've got this chunk of land out on the eastern border of Denver, on Leetsdale and Havana, or Parker Road in Havana. And I think I could get council to name it Babi Yar Park. And he was successful, and council did do that at a certain point. Lillian had, obviously she wasn't a landscape architect. She didn't know the scope of the project that she was about to birth, but she thought it would be great if they could have a sculpture competition and have a sculpture put up in the park, and then she would get the school children in Denver to plant flowers around the sculpture. The park was 27 acres. Any sculpture they could possibly afford at that time would be lost in 27 acres, of course.
Yes.
So at the same time, she decided she wanted to get somebody younger involved. She had a family friend named Helen Ginsberg, who was the daughter of a friend of hers. And she asked Helen if she would be interested in chairing a committee to work out the details for doing the sculpture competition and the flower planting. And and Helen got together a group of people, some prominent people in the Jewish community, and an aspiring young architect, which was me, and another well-known architect at the time, Charles Sink, who was a friend of mine, who was chairman of the Denver Art Commission at the time. And she got us together at a meeting at the Jewish Community Center and presented this idea. Chuck Sink and I were talking. We said, well, number one, the park is too big to have a piece of sculpture that any of these folks could possibly raise money for. So why not hire a landscape architect to design the park to be a memorial to the Babi Yar incident? I should say that the Soviet Union wanted to repress everything that had to do with Babi Yar, and mostly with the Holocaust, because in fact there were complicit in most of these massacres citizens from the Soviet Union with the Nazis. That became a sticking point for us later on. So they really didn't want to make a big thing out of the massacre of a bunch of Jews because they didn't want to make anything of the Jews anyway. So Chuck and I made the suggestion to the group that that we really should hire a landscape architect to design the park and have a well conceived issue. In any case, at a subsequent meeting, Mrs. Hoffman came up with with an idea for a landscape architect. I had an idea of who I'd like to hire, but who was a natural really. But she said she had a friend who had been president of Hadassah, which is the women's Zionist group in the United States, and her friend had a son who was a landscape architect. And in my head, I guess I said bingo, because I knew who it was. It was Lawrence Halpern, who was a world-famous landscape architect at the time, whose practice was in San Francisco. And he had actually, he and his partners had designed Skyline Park in Denver before. So that was another plus, really, because he was a known quantity here. And when she said the name, I said, absolutely, we should get a hold of them. And so Helen made contact with Lawrence Halpern, and we started the design process.
Now, I understand there was another Japanese man that.
Well, Lawrence Halpern had 4 partners at that time, and Satoru Nishita was one of his design partners. Nishita had actually been the design partner on Skyline Park as well. So Nishita was well known in the landscape community. So he was assigned the job of designing the park, actually. Halpern firm had projects all over the country and in Israel as well, and they did a great deal of work. So they were quite busy at the time. So Nishita put together some initial sketches, and Helen started work on fundraising for the park. And as the design developed, it appeared that the budget was going to go close to $1 million, because our idea, Halpern was well known for what were known at that time as participatory fountains. He had designed a series of fountains in Portland, Oregon, in which people could actually wade and wander, and they just sort of flowed all over parts of the landscape. And he did, I think there were 3 of them, and he did also a major plaza in the middle of Portland. And at that time he'd also done some work in Dallas, and a participatory fountain in Dallas, which was well known, and several others. So our idea was to have one of those. And the cost of doing one of those and the overall park development, it looked like was going to go close to $1 million. And that was in 1971, 72, 73, thereabouts. And Lil Hoffman, and by that time, sadly, Rabbi Edelman had passed away before the park ideas were even started. So it was Rabbi Zwerin and Lil Hoffman and Shelly Steinhauser who were the sort of mainstays of the committee, and now Helen. And then she had this committee of about 20 people, which narrowed down to about maybe 10, who became the sort of advisory board. And Lil started to get cold feet because she saw that fundraising for the park was going to eclipse their fundraising to get Jewish people out of the Soviet Union. And she and several of the other founders, Andrea Rosenberg was one, and Roz Duman and several others, opted out of doing anything more for the park. There's a lot of acrimony attached to that, but we won't get into that. But Helen and the rest of us saw the benefit to Denver of doing the park, and saw the park as being effective in what Lil wanted to do, regardless of whether she wanted to participate. So we decided to pursue it. And there were about 10 of us, I guess. We got some younger people, a couple of younger attorneys who were not Jewish. We decided to incorporate, and we brought some more people, some non-Jewish people, onto our board. A couple of young attorneys and the fellow who was head of Montgomery Ward in Denver at the time. And we still had some of our Jewish people who were with us, Jack Shapiro and Ben Blumberg and Phil Milstein. And
how did you see your role as in the
well,
creation of
at
the
that
park?
time, I became a vice president of the board, and I always saw my role as sort of one who was, since I'm an architect, I could coordinate with the landscape architecture firm and the city, the city was the owner of the park, and they would be the ones who would contract with Halpern and Associates for the design and construction of the park. And so I was the liaison between the city's landscape architect and Halpern and the board. So that was basically my function for a long time. And all during this, I mean, this was a period of 12 years that it took us to, and Helen was just she was a tiger. I mean, she just stuck to it, and she had contacts, and she was willing to go out and cold call people, and she knew a number of people in the community. I wasn't that well into the Jewish community, and she just kept at it. And at a certain point, she had gotten Senator Henry Jackson from the state of Washington to become one of our honorary vice presidents, and gotten Governor Dick Lamb also to become one of our honorary vice presidents. And so she really recruited a lot of people who were willing to help us, at least give us moral help. And through some of them, she was able to work out a meeting with President Carter at the end of the 70s, and President Carter wasn't prepared to deal with Helen, that's for sure. But she and several members of our board, Bob Loop and Keith Schwader, we had an executive director who sadly later on ended up in prison, so I won't name him, who all met with President Carter, and he said there were funds from an environmental program which he had some that were unspent in Colorado yet, that he could probably attach to Babi Yar Park. And at that time, I knew Governor Lamb fairly well, and And we found out when those funds were actually dispersed to the state that the manager of parks of the state at that time wasn't told where the funds were to go. And I got a call from one of our board members telling me that I really should go and meet with this guy and tell him where these funds should go, because he was ready to put them into state parks. And so I had a meeting with him, and I said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, these funds were specifically brought to Colorado for the benefit of the city and county of Denver for Babi Yar Park. And fortunately, he saw the light and distributed the funds to the city.
And at the time
Helen, we didn't have a lot of funds, and we had already contracted, the city had already contracted to have the granite monuments that Nishita had designed for the park. They were already in the process of being fabricated and installed. And then at the same time, sometime earlier actually, the Ukrainian immigrant community in Denver had gotten wind of the park and had met with the park's manager, Joe Chiancho was his name, and had told him that they were members of a group that had actually lost people at Babi Yar, because the Babi Yar massacre, after the initial massacre of the 30,000 remaining Jews in Kiev, continued for 2 years. And there were 30,000 Jews killed initially, but there were over 200,000 people in the Kiev area who were ultimately dumped in the Babi Yar ravine. Many of them were Ukrainians, and the issue with we had an issue with the Committee of Concern, because there were survivors of the Holocaust on the committee at that time, and many of them were from Ukraine and had experienced savagery from their own compatriots, and they didn't want the Ukrainians to have anything to do with Babi Yar Park. But these people were persistent as Helen actually, and they got to Helen to such a degree that she almost had a nervous breakdown. And at one meeting we had, actually at Larry Meisel's office, she said, "Alan, I can't do this anymore, you take it." And so that's how I ended up becoming president of the Babi Yar Park Foundation.
Let me go backwards just a second, because when Helen was explaining to us about the funds that were the federal funds that were reallocated from the federal government, she had mentioned that they were funds that weren't used for the Thompson flood, and she mentioned there that she couldn't remember the amount of funds, and I was hoping
it was $75,000.
Okay, great.
And I think I have that documented somewhere. The actual program that the funds came from was called Model Cities, and since the big Thompson flood had happened, that was a major incident, and the Model Cities program was not just for cities, but for that kind of issue as well. So yes, they were funds that were ultimately designated for the big Thompson flood, but
that
it came originally out of
the
Model Cities program. But I knew that only because I'm an urban designer, and I had knowledge of that program. Of course, we had to, when we incorporated, our board was recomposed of other people, and we got many non-Jewish people in Denver worked into it. The Ukrainians ultimately, because they were also citizens of Denver, had a great impact, and the mayor told us at one point when we were, Rabbi Zwerin and Alice Abrams, another member of our board, a jewelry artist in Denver, had put together the inscriptions. Primarily rabbis were, and the Ukrainians wanted an inscription in Ukrainian, and wanted Ukrainians mentioned in the inscriptions in the area of the park that we call the People Place, which is a bowl-shaped natural amphitheater. Ultimately, Mayor McNichols said if we didn't make peace with the Ukrainians, there weren't going to be any inscriptions on the monuments. And of course, he had that power. It was his park, basically. So we had a series of meetings to negotiate the inscriptions with the Ukrainians. Two of the Ukrainian leaders, Ivan Stabelsky and George Mushinsky, and they were as persistent in their way as Helen was in hers, and that's how they got to her. I mean, they were just unbelievable. So ultimately, we had a meeting at the home of a prominent meat packer in Denver. Auerbach was his name. Forgot his first name. But Shelly Steinhauser was there, and Helen, and Jim Buchanan, who was one of our vice presidents and an attorney. And we gave them basically an ultimatum that these were the inscriptions, and it included an inscription in Ukrainian, which was basically a similar inscription that we had in English. And they said, okay, well, maybe we can have one more session. I said, okay, you can meet with me in my office. We set a date for the two of them to meet with me in my office, which was at that time downtown on Blake Street. And we met that day in my office, George and Ivan and me, and I gave them the final draft of the inscriptions, and they asked me to go out of the room. They were going to discuss it. They're going to discuss it in Ukrainian. And I said, well, I don't speak Ukrainian. They said, please leave the room. So I did, and then they called me in, and they said, okay. And that's how the inscriptions got on the monuments at Babi Yar Park. And in the meantime, we had the monuments had been contracted to Erickson Memorial, which was a very prominent memorial maker, tombstone maker in Denver. And Roy Erickson was very helpful to us in getting the monuments fabricated to help to Nishita's requirements. Actually, ultimately, Halprin himself took the firm out of the project, and he was in the process of downsizing, so his four partners had separated from him, Nishita, McCulley, Baxter, and forgot the fourth one, but they formed their own firm. So ultimately, the landscape firm that was involved in the completion of the park was CHNMB. But because Halprin didn't want to be involved in the initial brouhaha that we had. So the park was in the basic design characteristic, but it was not well executed. The details of the park were not well executed, and for a long time the park had started to deteriorate. The paths were gravel, and the sides of the paths were not straight. And if you looked, there were it was visible from the air. If you flew over it in a plane, and at that time I was doing some work in Aspen, and I was flying back and forth, and was able to see the park from the air, and it was quite visible. And then, of course, Google came up with Google Maps, and I was able to see actual flights of the park from the air, and the paths were not straight, and the stone we have a memorial stone in the forest that remembers, as we call it, and that was to have a little bubbling fountain come out of it. At the beginning of the 2000s, I think it was, Helen had been talking with Larry, and Larry had always been interested in Babi Yar Park. He was one of our original donors, and he told us that he had been taking people out to Babi Yar Park all the time, and he asked if there were anything that we wanted to do that we hadn't done before. And so I prepared a wish list of things that we wanted to do with Babi Yar Park. And we had a meeting with Larry and with Ellen Premack, who was at that time the director of the Maisel Museum. And he said, well, I have a lot of connections in the city, which were significant, really. I can probably get them to appropriate some money, and I can put in a little bit of my own money as seed money, and we can get some of those things done for you. And you know, I had talked about straightening out the paths and paving the entrance plaza, which was gravel at that time and not well defined, and then paving the areas around the stone monuments, and at either end of the bridge, which had stone monuments. And so we started that process, and then at a certain point, Larry had an idea that he wanted to create a memorial for the terrorized peoples of the world, basically, and it was a much more generalized thing than a Holocaust memorial. And he wanted to have a worldwide competition to do this, and he enlisted people from the community and from the board of the Maisel Museum to be the jury for this memorial. And it was well publicized, and he had graphics done, and we actually had we had commissioned David Treiba, who's a prominent architect in Denver, David Daniel, who's a well-known architect now with another firm, from his firm, was working with us for a new master plan for Babi Yar Park, including this possible memorial. So during that time, we also had the Maisel Museum had a president. We had I was named. Helen didn't want to participate, so I was named to the board of advisors of the Maisel Museum. The board of directors were all prominent people in the community who were able to give a lot of money. So the board of advisors was a group of scholars and participants in the community who were basically knowledgeable about the subjects they were dealing with. Bernie Karshmer, who was the dean of the School of Medicine, the dental school, excuse me, at CU, became the president of the board of advisors, and he was with us on that group. And we had this competition worldwide. We had a very prominent Russian architect and sculptor as one of the competitors, and we had sculptors from all over the country who are well known, who were interested in the project. And as a matter of fact, this Russian person brought an entourage to Denver from Russia at that time. He had done absolutely incredible monumental sculptures. But the winning design that we all decided on was one done by Krzysztof Wazisko and Julian Bonder from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who were, Julian was a professor of architecture, and Krzysztof was an internationally known sculptor of monumental works. He did the memorial sculpture at Hiroshima, and he was actually featured in the New York Times about 4 or 5 months ago on one of their Sunday issues. He was teaching at MIT, he's now teaching at Harvard. But Larry allowed them to be hired, and they did a design for the monumental treatment that he was interested in. The cost was significant, and then all of a sudden Larry got sidetracked. He had a lot of the pieces of steel from the World Trade Center had become available through a court order for monuments throughout the country. So Larry had the idea that before we did the great monument, he wanted to do a smaller section of the park devoted to a memorial to 9/11. And he commissioned Wazisko and Bonder to do that work. And he was going to do that immediately. So they put together a design, as I mentioned to you before, Larry doesn't really understand what architects and designers do, and he doesn't understand what scholarship means. And they wanted to bring a board of scholars on to advise them, because it was a really significant monument and was going to, have a significant impact, especially at Babi Yar Park. And we had, Julian and I had gone to the park and taken a lot of pictures, and Jim Bershoff, a local architect, was affiliated with them, Oz Architecture. And Jim and I had gone to the park to reconnoiter a place where Julian and Krzysztof could design the monument. And they did a lot of sketches of the monument. We actually, a group of us, including Tina Bishop, who was also involved as a landscape architect to be a consultant on the redevelopment of the park. All of us went to a hangar in New York City where all these pieces of the World Trade Center were, and Wazisko and Bonder selected a bunch of pieces to compose the monument that they had done. And those pieces were actually brought to Denver with great ceremony, and Larry had them, had these, there was a semi-trailer full of them that was parked in front of City and County building, and we had a great ceremony one day with those pieces there that Larry had organized. And then the whole effort really crumbled as we we interviewed contractors to do the work, and Larry saw the cost and what Julian and Krzysztof were going to do, and Larry had not a good relationship with architects all along, and he didn't really understand what they were going to do. And finally, he and Julian had a falling out, and he just divorced himself from the whole project, but not before having Tina Bishop commissioned by the city, actually, to do a complete renovation, I'll say, of the park. She was able to do the things that we were not able to do initially, and she put concrete edges on the paths, so they were straightened out. She was able to do granite sets in the paving of the walk to the main entrance plaza, paving the entrance plaza, putting and defining the entrance plaza with low walls that you could sit on, so the monuments could be really inside a frame. We also had a small monument inside the entrance, which is a speaking monument. You push a button, and Jim Buchanan's voice tells the story of Babi Yar. And that was renovated also with modern components. That we had a cassette tape that always went out, and the cassette tape player died, and they had to replace it several times, and finally we were able to replace it with modern electronic technology with the voice on a computer chip and all of that. So it's now in working condition. The fountain does work again, but the city doesn't run the fountain, so we still have that problem.
It was under my understanding that the fountain actually watered the trees.
No.
Okay.
The fountain, if this were the stone, which the stone is actually about 12 feet in diameter. It's not a circle. It's a very rough cut. In the center of it is a hole, and then there's a triangular depression in the stone, and out of that hole in the center of the stone bubbles water that spreads out over the triangular area, and then drains into the. It looks like it drains into the ground, but actually there's a basin beneath. So the water actually recirculates, and it's just a little bubbling fountain in the middle of the stone. No, the trees have, and that's another thing that Tina was able to do in her landscape redo of the park, was to do a sprinkler system for the grass areas in the people place and the trees in the Grove of Remembrance. So, and her work was really the crowning glory, because now the park is complete to the degree that Helen and I had never been able to do, and we were very satisfied that the other monuments have never been built, because the park now is exactly how we conceived it, and how Satnashita died in 2013, and he hadn't seen the park since it was finished, but it was basically right in keeping with his desires for the park. Well, of course, the Maisel Museum initially, in its original state, the group of Holocaust survivors in Denver had organized with several of the rabbis a memorial service on the date of the original Babi Yar massacre. The original Babi Yar massacre was in fact on Erev Yom Kippur of 1941. It was in our terms it was 21st of September, 1941, and they every 21st of September, or a Sunday that might be close to that date, they organized a a sort of off-the-cuff service at Babi Yar Park in front of the two entrance monuments, since the rest of the park was not easily accessible to handicapped people. That's another thing that Tina was able to do, was to make it more accessible to the handicapped. But that off-the-cuff service morphed into a more formal thing with the Jewish community and the Holocaust survivors, and finally the Maisel Museum has taken it over and still does a service at Babi Yar Park in the People Place every year on whatever Sunday in September is closest to the 21st.
Decades ago, still the aching sadness, innocence, people who love, forever silenced by Nazi terror, sharing eternally the mystic number 6 million. A Holocaust for the Jews of Europe, a tragedy for all humanity. Remember.